The ballroom glowed beneath the crystal chandeliers, each one spilling golden light across polished marble floors and rich velvet carpets that swallowed sound with elegance. Waiters drifted quietly, balancing trays of champagne flutes, while a string quartet filled the air with soft music that barely rose above the hum of conversation. The night was more than a gathering, it was a coronation of wealth, power, and status. Every corner of the room shimmered with money, from the cufflinks worth more than houses to the imported roses arranged in towering glass vases. This was where empires were sealed, where reputations were cemented. Tonight was supposed to be Victor Lang's crowning moment. Victor stood tall in the center of the room, his suit cut from Italian fabric so sharp it looked like it could slice through air. His hair, streaked with silver, was slicked back in the style of a man who knew the world bent to him. He was the kind of billionaire who didn't walk into a room, he owned it by existing. Men leaned in to listen when he spoke, women fluttered at his smile, and competitors shrank under the weight of his arrogance. His empire spanned continents, controlling everything from shipping lines to skyscrapers. To him, tonight's $10 billion merger was not just business, it was a legacy carved in gold ink. The investors from Europe watched him with keen interest, especially Klaus Richter, the German financier who carried the reputation of a hawk disguised as a diplomat. Klaus respected power, but he respected respect even more. That nuance, subtle but absolute, would later prove crucial. For now, his expression was unreadable, his hands folded neatly in front of him as he observed Victor bask in the spotlight. Near the edges of the ballroom, moving with quiet grace, was Maya Johnson. She wore the standard black attire of the event coordinators, her figure blending easily into the background. Her hair, thick curls pulled into a bun, caught a subtle gleam under the chandelier. To most guests, she was invisible, just another piece of the machinery that kept luxury events humming. She guided staff, directed waiters, adjusted microphones, all with an ease that came from more than just training. There was something about her calm, observant presence that made her feel less like background and more like someone watching the board of a chess game, waiting for the right moment. When Victor's entourage approached the signing table, the crowd parted as if pushed by invisible hands. Cameras clicked. Journalists leaned forward, pens ready. Victor loved the spectacle, the adoration. He loved being the reason every head turned. As he stepped toward the long table draped in white silk, Maya stepped into his path, poised, professional, offering a welcoming smile. "Welcome, Mr. Lang," she said, her voice warm but steady. She extended her hand. "I'm Maya Johnson. It's an honor to have you here tonight." The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment. A simple handshake, something polite, standard, human. But Victor's eyes flicked down to her hand and then back to her face with disdain. His lip curled upward in a half-smirk, half-snarl. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his own hand halfway, as though considering it, before withdrawing it with a dismissive flick. "I don't shake hands with staff," he announced loudly enough for those nearby to hear. The words dropped like a stone into water. A ripple of laughter echoed from the men in his orbit, sycophants trained to mirror his arrogance. One of them snickered. Another muttered something under his breath that earned a chorus of smug chuckles. Victor's eyes sparkled with cruel satisfaction, as though the humiliation of another human being was a fine wine to be savored. Maya's hand hung in the air for a heartbeat longer before she lowered it gracefully, her face serene, her voice unshaken. "Of course," she said lightly, though her eyes carried a sharpness that burned hotter than any raised voice could. One banker nearby raised his brows, surprised by her composure. Others exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, some indulgent. For Victor, it was nothing, a routine dismissal, an act of dominance he'd rehearsed countless times. To him, the staff were props, invisible until they were needed, disposable when they weren't. But what Victor failed to notice was the shift in the air. Whispers began to pass like wind through tall grass. A few investors frowned. Klaus Richter, in particular, tilted his head, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as he observed Maya's calm reaction. It wasn't what he expected. A lesser person would have flinched, reddened, disappeared into the shadows. But Maya stood tall, unshaken, her gaze steady. Victor turned his back to her, already bored, already searching for the next person to charm, the next spotlight to step into. His arrogance was so complete that he didn't even notice the faint hardening of Maya's jaw, the flicker of calculation in her eyes. To him, she was nothing more than furniture in the room. To her, he had just opened a door he would later regret stepping through. The chatter resumed, the quartet played on, but beneath the polished surface of the evening, something had shifted. Maya moved back into her rhythm, guiding a waiter, checking on microphones, smiling politely. Yet her eyes, sharp as glass, never left Victor for long. She wasn't angry. Anger would have been too easy, too predictable. No, she was something else entirely, watchful, patient, and ready. Victor, oblivious, raised his glass for a toast, laughter booming as he joked with foreign investors about dominance, power, and winning at all costs. He didn't notice the way Klaus glanced at Maya again, curiosity flickering behind the financier's cold blue eyes. He didn't notice the quiet hum of interest building around her, the subtle recognition that she was not what she seemed. And he certainly didn't notice that his words, meant as nothing more than another show of superiority, had planted the seed of his downfall. As the signing ceremony drew closer, the room buzzed louder, tension mounting with anticipation. Victor adjusted his tie, smirked for the cameras, and soaked in the glow of inevitability. In his mind, the deal was already his. In his mind, the night was his coronation. But just beyond the reach of his arrogance, Maya stood poised, calm, and quietly sharpening the knife of consequence. And though Victor didn't know it yet, his empire had already begun to crack the moment he refused her hand. The night pressed forward with the heavy rhythm of expectation. Glasses clinked as waiters refilled drinks, and conversations buzzed like a hive of restless bees. Victor thrived in it, feeding on the attention, his laughter booming across the ballroom like thunder. Cameras followed his every movement, catching the practiced tilt of his chin, the flash of his smile. To most, it looked like the portrait of success, the kind of image that would grace magazine covers and front pages. Yet beneath the surface, the air felt heavier, threaded with something unspoken, as though the insult he had tossed so casually had left a crack that widened with each passing minute. Maya continued to move silently among the crowd, her presence subtle yet commanding in ways few noticed. She guided a waiter away from a stumbling guest, adjusted a microphone before a speech, and spoke softly to the AV team as though orchestrating the rhythm of the night. She played her role perfectly, but her eyes were sharper now, calculating. She was not invisible, not truly. Several noticed her poise, the effortless authority hidden under the guise of service. Klaus Richter noticed most of all. Victor, meanwhile, stood at the center, flanked by his CFO and legal advisors. He pointed toward the press with a smirk. "Make sure they get the right angles," he ordered. "This night is history in the making. $10 billion doesn't come together every day." His CFO chuckled nervously, adjusting his tie. "Yes, Victor. Everyone's ready. Just a few more minutes before the ceremony." Victor's eyes flicked toward Maya, who was speaking quietly to two European investors near the bar. "Amazing how the staff keeps wandering into conversations," he muttered, his voice low but sharp enough for his circle to hear. "They're supposed to blend into the walls, not mingle with billionaires." One of his advisors laughed awkwardly. "She does seem unusually confident." Victor's smirk widened. "Confidence means nothing without money. Let her play pretend. At the end of the day, she'll still be serving drinks while I close history." He turned back to the investors who were circling him like moths to flame. One asked about the global shipping lanes Victor controlled. Another questioned his plans for expansion in the Middle East. Victor's answers were smooth, rehearsed, every word dripping with ego. He spoke not just to inform but to impress, puffing himself up with each statement until the room felt smaller around his presence. But the whispers wouldn't die. Around the ballroom, murmurs of his earlier dismissal spread like sparks on dry grass. Some found it amusing, chalking it up to Victor's notorious arrogance. Others frowned, the disrespect souring what was supposed to be a celebration. A few looked toward Maya with curiosity, wondering how she managed to hold her dignity after such a public slight. Klaus Richter approached her during a lull, his tall frame cutting easily through the crowd. His voice was low, tinged with his thick German accent. "You handled that well," he said, eyes narrowing. "Most would have flushed red or stormed away." Maya gave him a faint smile, her tone calm. "I don't embarrass easily, Mr. Richter. Life is too short to waste on arrogance." Klaus studied her, intrigued. "Still, it was distasteful. In my country, respect matters more than bravado." Across the room, Victor caught sight of the exchange. His smirk faltered into a frown. "Unbelievable," he muttered to his CFO. "The staff are chatting with my investors. She's probably telling them how to fold napkins." The CFO hesitated. "Maybe we should." "No," Victor cut him off. "Let her. It only proves what I said. She doesn't know her place." But the truth was more dangerous than he imagined. Maya wasn't just making small talk. She was answering Klaus's pointed questions, clarifying minor details about the syndicate's expectations for the merger. Her words were precise, authoritative, carrying the confidence of someone who knew every line of the contract by heart. Klaus nodded thoughtfully, filing away the subtle revelation. The tension thickened when the announcer tapped the microphone, signaling the start of the signing ceremony. The crowd surged toward the long table draped in white silk, cameras flashing furiously as reporters pressed closer. Victor strutted toward the table as though walking a runway, basking in the adoration. He shook hands with Klaus, posed for photographers, and flashed his signature smile for the press. Maya remained a quiet shadow at the edge of the investors' group, her gaze calm, her movements controlled. The golden badge pinned to her chest caught the faint glint of chandelier light again, though no one seemed to notice. It didn't say "Event Staff," but in the chaos, Victor never looked closely enough to read it. Victor sat at the center of the table, his hands spread wide like a king preparing to claim his throne. He leaned toward the microphones, his voice booming with performative charm. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we make history. This partnership ensures not just prosperity for our companies but stability for the global economy. $10 billion in shared vision, sealed in trust." The audience applauded. Cameras clicked faster. Victor reached for the gold pen resting on the contract, savoring the moment. He paused just long enough to let the flashbulbs pop, his smile stretching as if he already saw tomorrow's headlines. Behind him, Maya stood still, her hands folded, her gaze steady. Klaus glanced back at her briefly before leaning toward the document. He frowned, scanning a page with careful precision. His brow furrowed. "Wait," Klaus said softly, but his voice carried. "I believe there is still an amendment we have not confirmed." The applause faltered. Reporters exchanged puzzled looks. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Victor blinked, his smile stiffening. "What amendment?" he asked, his tone sharp. Klaus gestured casually toward Maya. "Ms. Johnson, would you clarify?" Every head in the room turned as if pulled by invisible strings. The cameras swiveled, lenses zooming in on her calm face. Victor's expression soured into confusion. He followed their gaze, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Maya stepping forward with measured confidence. For the first time all night, Victor felt something strange, something close to unease. And Maya, still wearing that serene, unshaken smile, was about to show him exactly why the ground beneath him was no longer solid. The silence that followed Klaus's words pressed down on the room like a weight. For the first time that evening, Victor's certainty cracked. He looked at Klaus, then at the thick contract in front of him, and finally toward the woman he had dismissed as staff. She was no longer moving in the background, no longer an invisible figure in black. Maya stepped forward into the full blaze of the chandeliers, her heels striking the marble floor with deliberate rhythm. The room seemed to shift with each step she took, as though gravity itself acknowledged her. Victor forced a laugh, hollow and sharp. "What amendment? Everything has been finalized. This is theatrics, Klaus. You know the deal as well as I do." He looked around for support, expecting nods of agreement, but he found only curious, watchful eyes. Maya reached the table and placed a folder on the polished wood with a quiet finality. Her voice carried, steady and clear, with the weight of authority that silenced whispers instantly. Clause 14.3 Equity distribution adjustments in the event of majority ownership changes. It was included to protect the syndicate's long-term interests. She opened the folder, sliding a neatly tabbed document across to Klaus, who examined it with sharp eyes. The cameras caught every movement, lenses drinking in the scene that was rapidly turning from coronation into confrontation. Victor stared at her, disbelief hardening into fury. "Excuse me," he said, voice thick with venom. "This is business for executives, not for—" Maya's gaze locked onto his, unflinching. "Not for staff?" She finished for him, her tone icy but calm. "Perhaps you should read my badge more carefully before making assumptions." The glint of gold pinned to her chest caught the light again. This time, with every camera aimed at her, the lettering was unmistakable: Lead Counsel, Johnson and Associates. The crowd erupted with a collective gasp. Journalists whispered furiously into recorders, investors leaned forward, and the flashbulbs strobed like lightning. The expression on Victor's face twisted from arrogance to confusion, then collapsed into something closer to panic. "You," he stammered, pointing at her with a trembling hand. This is absurd. You're not part of this." Klaus's smile was small but cutting. "On the contrary, Victor. She is the counsel who reviewed every line of this agreement on behalf of the syndicate. Without her approval, this contract is nothing but paper." Laughter rippled through the room, this time at Victor's expense. Some of the European investors exchanged knowing smirks, while others shook their heads at his folly. The humiliation was sharp, public, and merciless. Maya remained composed, her voice measured. "This isn't about theatrics. This is about respect. Business requires it. Partnership requires it. You've shown either tonight." She slid the contract back toward Klaus, her fingertips barely grazing the edge. "The syndicate does not bind itself to partners who treat dignity as disposable." Victor lunged for the papers, desperate to reclaim control. "Nonsense! This is manipulation. This is a stunt. You can't undo a $10 billion deal over. His voice faltered, the words choking in his throat. "Over a handshake?" Maya's tone was sharp as glass, slicing through the air. "It wasn't just a handshake, Mr. Lang. It was a choice. A choice to show the world how little you value the people who keep it turning. And choices have consequences." The cameras zoomed closer, capturing every flicker of emotion across Victor's face. Sweat glistened on his temple under the hot lights. His hand, once so steady in commanding boardrooms, now trembled slightly as he tried to hold his composure. "You think this makes you powerful?" he hissed at her, his voice dropping but still caught by the microphones. "You think embarrassing me makes you their equal? You're nothing without this table, without these men." Klaus interjected smoothly, his accent cutting through like a blade. "Careful, Victor. The more you speak, the more you reveal. Power is not in money alone, it is in respect. Something Ms. Johnson has in abundance tonight." The financiers around the table nodded, murmuring in agreement. One leaned toward another, whispering just loud enough for the cameras to catch. "She has more composure than he's had all night." Maya placed her hands lightly on the table, leaning in just enough to command the room without aggression. "This isn't about me being equal. This is about you showing the world what kind of man you are. And in front of these cameras, in front of your investors, you've made it clear. You dismiss, you belittle, you insult. That is not leadership, it's weakness." The air seemed to vibrate with the force of her words. The journalists scribbled faster, some typing furiously into tablets. The live feeds broadcasting the event began to pick up momentum online, the humiliation spreading beyond the ballroom. Victor's voice cracked as he tried to respond. "You can't, you wouldn't dare stop this. Do you know how many jobs, how many industries depend on this merger? Do you know who I am?" Maya's lips curved into the faintest smile, one that carried no warmth but only a sharp certainty. "I know exactly who you are. And I know exactly what I represent tonight. This syndicate trusts me. And I will not let them bind themselves to a man who sees human dignity as beneath him. Her words hung in the air like a gavel strike. Klaus leaned back, crossing his arms, watching Victor unravel. Perhaps, he said softly, you should have shaken her hand. The remark drew laughter, genuine and sharp, from several in the audience. The sound only deepened Victor's humiliation. His once commanding posture collapsed inward, his shoulders tight, his face pale. He looked not like a billionaire at the height of his empire but like a man cornered, stripped of his armor. Maya straightened, gathering the folder in one smooth motion. Her eyes never left Victor's. The syndicate values respect, Mr. Lang. You've shown us tonight that you don't. And for that, there will be consequences. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was final. Everyone in the room understood that something irreversible had just been set in motion. Victor sank back into his chair, his mouth opening and closing with no words forming. For a man who had lived his life commanding every room he entered, silence was the cruelest humiliation of all. And as Maya stepped back from the table, every eye followed her. She no longer blended into the background. She was the storm Victor never saw coming, and the crowd knew the thunderclap was still to come. The ballroom was suffocating in its silence, broken only by the quiet clicks of camera shutters and the low hum of whispers spreading like wildfire. The $10 billion deal that had been touted as Victor Lang's crowning moment now hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of collapse. Every eye was fixed on Maya, who stood poised with the quiet strength of someone utterly in control. She held none of Victor's bluster, none of his arrogance, and yet the room bent toward her as though she were the only one holding it together. Victor, still seated at the signing table, looked like a man whose crown had been ripped from his head in front of the world. His once practiced smile had evaporated, leaving behind a face twisted with disbelief. He slammed his hand on the polished wood, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "You can't do this!" he shouted, his voice hoarse, desperate. "You have no authority to pull the deal. Do you know what's at stake? Do you know who I am?" Maya met his fury with calm eyes that betrayed not a flicker of doubt. "I know exactly who you are," she replied, her tone measured, deliberate. "And that's why this deal is finished." The words hit harder than any outburst could. Gasps rippled through the audience, journalists leaning forward so quickly that pens nearly tore through paper. The European investors straightened in their seats, some exchanging knowing glances, others nodding as though an inevitable truth had just been spoken aloud. Klaus Richter leaned back, his lips curved in a small, satisfied smile, as though this outcome had been written in the stars all along. Victor's fists clenched, his knuckles white against the contract. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice trembling between rage and panic. "You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it. No one crosses me and walks away unscathed." Maya didn't flinch. Her silence was a weapon sharper than any insult. When she finally spoke, her words cut with precision. "No one walks away unscathed when respect is stripped from the table. Tonight, the only mistake was yours." She turned toward Klaus and the syndicate representatives. "Effective immediately, the agreement is withdrawn. The syndicate will not proceed with Mr. Lang or his empire. Consider this matter closed." The declaration dropped like a hammer. The room erupted in noise, reporters shouting questions, flashes bursting like fireworks, investors rising from their chairs in a flurry of movement. Phones lit up with messages as news outlets scrambled to break the story. The empire Victor had built, the reputation he had polished for decades, was unraveling in real time. Victor surged to his feet, his chair scraping violently across the floor. He lunged for the contract, as though grabbing the papers could somehow salvage the deal. But Klaus's hand came down flat across the document, pinning it to the table with quiet authority. "Enough," Klaus said coldly. "You've done enough damage tonight." Victor froze, his breath ragged, his eyes darting wildly around the room. He saw the faces, once adoring, now mocking, disbelieving, some even disgusted. He saw the journalists scribbling his downfall into headlines. He saw his investors, people who once followed his lead unquestioningly, now looking at Maya with respect that had never been given to him freely. "You can't just walk away from me," he barked, voice cracking under the strain. "I am Victor Lang. My signature is worth more than any of yours." Maya stepped closer, her calm presence cutting through his chaos. "Your signature was worth $10 billion, she said evenly, until you proved to the world it was backed by nothing more than arrogance. Respect isn't a courtesy, Mr. Lang. It's the foundation. Without it, every empire crumbles." Her words landed with the weight of prophecy, and Victor sagged, his defiance collapsing into something hollow. His lips moved soundlessly, his pride refusing to let him beg, yet offering him no other weapon. He sank back into his chair, staring blankly at the contract that now meant nothing. Meanwhile, Klaus stood and extended his hand toward Maya. Cameras zoomed in, eager to catch the moment. Maya accepted with a steady grip, her handshake firm and dignified. The investors followed suit, standing behind her, aligning themselves with her presence rather than Victor's fading shadow. In that instant, the image was undeniable. Maya Johnson, once dismissed as invisible staff, now stood as the embodiment of authority, while Victor Lang, billionaire mogul, was reduced to a relic of arrogance. Applause broke out, not for Victor, but for Maya. It started with a few claps, tentative and cautious, before swelling into something undeniable, a wave of approval that filled the cavernous room. Some guests laughed openly at Victor's downfall, others shook their heads at the irony, and still others raised their glasses quietly in Maya's direction. Victor buried his face in his hands. The cameras caught everything, the sweat on his brow, the slump of his shoulders, the wreckage of his pride. He had come to the ballroom to crown himself king of the business world. He was leaving as a cautionary tale. Maya stepped away from the table, her stride steady, her posture tall. Reporters swarmed, shouting her name, microphones thrust forward. Questions rained down. "Why withdraw the deal? What message are you sending? Do you believe Mr. Lang's behavior reflects his business practices?" She paused at the doorway, the flashes lighting her face in sharp bursts. Turning back just once, she gave the press, and Victor, the final word they would carry across every headline. "Respect isn't optional. It's the deal." The line hung in the air, echoing even as she walked into the crisp night beyond the ballroom. The cameras followed her to the waiting car, the crowd surging behind her, but she never once looked back. Inside, Victor sat frozen in his chair, alone in a room that had once worshipped him. His empire had not collapsed yet, but everyone present knew it had begun. The humiliation would follow him into boardrooms, into headlines, into the whispers of every business deal he tried to make. His $10 billion loss was not just financial, it was reputational, permanent, and devastating. Maya, meanwhile, disappeared into the night, her dignity intact, her poise unbroken. She had not raised her voice, had not needed to. Her strength lay in her restraint, in her certainty, in her refusal to let arrogance define the terms of respect. And so, the true story spread, a billionaire who believed he was untouchable, undone by the simple act of refusing a handshake, and a woman who proved that power without respect is no power at all.